Hey there everybody, this is Sky from Go for Games, and we want to do a little video about picking a new army, with 10th coming really soon, and we're getting teasers for all the rules and stuff. A lot of new players are looking to jump in with the new edition coming soon, and so we just want to talk about the different archetypes and what you should look for when you're trying to pick one for yourself. Um, I play Orcs and Adeptus Mechanicus, generally speaking. Chris plays Space Wolves and many flavors of Eldar, and I think you played Necrons before, right? But
Yes, I played Necrons for a very long time.
okay, well, what would you recommend to someone who's trying to decide what army they want to jump in on?
Well, I think we're actually in a really good position going into 10th because we're having the codexes turn into indexes for a while. And that's the thing I normally try to encourage people is, especially if it's your first faction, you should always try to pick something that you're attached to, like flavor-wise and lore and aesthetic, not what's competitive, because the what's competitive rotates and changes so often that if you go chasing that right out of the gate, you know, 3 months into it, it's going to change and you're going to be less competitive. And then you're going to feel bad because the faction you're playing, you're not attached to and it's not competitive. So why are you playing it? That sort of thing. It happens a lot with people, especially when they come from other games where they feel competitive there and they jump over here wanting to be competitive as well. But this is 40K is a major hobby. You have to put a lot of time and effort into it. So you should always have that one faction that you're grounded in, like you with Orcs or me with Space Wolves. We play a bunch of different factions, right? Like we both played Chaos in the past, and we both played, other weird factions. But as much as we've played them, we're grounded in that my faction that I identify with is that one that we, Space Wolves or Orcs, where we really feel like that is our faction that we can always come back to no matter how good they are or how in rough place they are at the time. So people should really be looking for that faction that they can love the lore of, because even if they ebb and flow out of 40K where they play for a while and then it's in a rough patch or they're busy at work or whatever else and they can't play as much, if they're really rooted in a faction, they can just listen to audible books and read stories online and things like that about their faction and still stay in touch with the game and their faction without maybe getting to play all the time like they normally would. So with that being said, the biggest thing to me is making sure that you learn a little bit about as many factions as you can, and as you're learning about the different Space Marine chapters and the different alien races or the Xenos races and stuff like that, eventually one of them's going to jump out to you and you're like, oh man, that's really cool. The salamanders are really about protecting humanity, not just in the normal way that a Space Marine does, but they like retire and then protect a village or something like that. Or the crafty kind of like looted vehicles of Orcs, and how it's always that crazy aesthetic along with crazy stories and the weird language and stuff like that used for Orcs. That's what you should really get attached to for your first faction. Again, going competitive right out the gate is always rough for people. We have friends that are, have done that in the past, and they stick with the game for, a few months of hobbying and then a few months of playing, and then something happens and they, fall out of it. And by the time they try to come back, their faction isn't very good anymore.
So,
Just it may only be for a short period of time, but all they
right.
see is that there's something better. So then they want to rotate factions, which means they don't even get to jump back in and play. They've got to do another, drop a bunch of money and a few more months of hobbying, that sort of thing.
And the
If
thing
we're
with
talking about,
in one
sorry, go ahead.
faction, the thing that's interesting too is, um, there's when people are looking at the competitive charts and like the win rates for certain factions and stuff. One, that changes often, but there's factors that people like don't mention often enough that affects what that looks like, which is like if a faction is new, there's going to be a lot more players of it because it like just came out, right?
Yep.
But that means those players are new. They don't know what they're doing all the time. So on a competitive level, it'll push the numbers for that faction down or whatever. And then
Yep.
at the same time, a faction can be like seen as objectively not as good in the win rate, but it might be because a lot of the players who are good players aren't playing them right now. And sometimes there's interesting cases, like there's a few AdMech players in the pool of several hundred who have like win rates way above, and they're always playing the same faction as everyone else. They're all playing AdMech, right? But
Yep.
that's because they stuck with the faction through the whole edition. They know like what counters every other thing and how to like really leverage it to a really specific level. And that's like the high skill cap of just staying with one faction. It takes time,
We
but
Yeah, no, we've seen that both on a local level and a national level. Because I remember back in the end of eighth, there nationally there was a Grey Knights player that was like taking tournaments and was crazy good, but everyone said Grey Knights was like the worst faction available at the time. But that player had been playing Grey Knights for like 3 editions, and that was their faction. They wouldn't give up on it because they knew their faction so well. It didn't matter. They knew their matchups. They knew where, these are my weaknesses, and despite those weaknesses, they could leverage them and let people be overconfident because they're playing a bad faction, and they were still winning. But locally, I mean, we have all sorts of weird players, including myself with Space Wolves. Space Wolves aren't in a bad place right now, but they used to be in a pretty rough place, kind of early in ninth. And despite that, I was still winning fairly often and things like that. So, yeah, both locally and nationally, there's examples of if you stick with the faction, you really make that yours, you can push through a lot of rough patches and still be good. And pushing through those rough patches, whether it's with your faction or eventually when you get a second faction, that's going to teach you a lot about the game, to make you a better player.
I think too playing one faction specifically helps a lot more with like unit rotation and changing lists and stuff like that, because then as you're collecting, you end up with more than a full size list, and that just adds options for you later. You know what I mean? Like,
Yep.
especially if you're enjoying the hobbying, like just because you made it to the list that you want to play, you might want to keep painting because you like painting or whatever, right? So it might be like that unit doesn't seem like something you want to take now, but an addition change or an update or a points drop or whatever, and suddenly you change your lists, or even just response to other people's list changing. You know what I mean? People are bringing a lot of flyers, so you start bringing anti-air stuff or whatever. Like,
Yeah.
it it's good to just get into the fluff of a faction and go that way, and it'll like reward you later. It's not clear when you're starting out, but like as a player who's done it a few times, going through the cycle, like, no, it's funny when you get like, oh, I have all these extra Terminators and I don't want to bring them to anything, but they're fun to paint, and then it turns out like 6 months later you're like, oh my gosh, the Terminators are so meta right now. Well, you already have them. You weren't playing
Yep.
the meta chasing game. You were just being the player.
Yeah, the same thing goes, and I think I'm actually about to accidentally fall into this situation when 10th hits, because we've seen some examples of how transports are going to be a little better next edition, and transports, unless you're in certain factions, but for Space Marines specifically, transports haven't been all that efficient lately. But I have a bunch of transports, drop pods, and land raiders and stuff like that sitting in my garage from back in like mid 7th edition, and admittedly, that's a really long game to play. Like, not everybody has to plan for that. But if you're just painting the stuff that you think is cool, or if you find like a good deal, you never have to feel bad about like, but do I really need a second Land Raider? When you can just sit on it and enjoy that as the hobby part and paint and try out new techniques. And then you just, if you're in the game long enough, which again, this is a long form hobby, it may not seem like it now, but you can really stick with this one. It'll eventually kind of come back around to where, even if it's for a short period of time, that unit is good again, and you're going to be happy that you have it.
Yeah, do you want to talk over like some of the styles of gameplay that armies have? Because I feel like that's probably what some people are going to ask.
Yep, and that actually folds into where I was going to go with the, if you're choosing a second faction. So a lot of times when there's an edition change, the engrossed players will decide to dust off an old faction that they haven't played in a long time, or decide to break out into a second or third faction, because it's a really nice breaking point of, we're going to have to learn new core rules. I might as well, like, while everybody's on a less high skill playing field, it's a good time to switch factions and learn a new faction. um, and one of the things that I would suggest is, when you're doing that, a lot of the factions have the ability to do a little bit of everything, right? But they have focuses. So, like, for example, Tau, there are models that can do close combat, like the Farseer and stuff like that. But realistically, Tau aren't meant to be a close combat faction, right? Like, that's not what they're designed to be. So if you're already a Tau player and you're going for a second faction, I don't think it necessarily makes sense, though you could, to like break out into another faction that feels very much the same, right? So if I'm going to go from Tau, and let's say I want to do Marines, right? Because everybody's doing Marines, and I want to do a weird flavor, and that seems fun, right? Because it's easy access to the models, they're fairly cheap because you can always find, broken down boxes and stuff like that. Well, if I go do a Marine faction after playing Tau, Iron Hands is also very gunline, and so is Ultramarines. So if I'm doing that, it doesn't make sense that I'm building this new faction to effectively play the game in not really a different way. When you go to another faction, you want to try to find something that's slightly different than what you're already playing. So if you know you're playing a Tau gunline, your second faction should probably interact with the assault phase way more. Because not
Yeah.
only is that going to give you a different flavor, because if you ever get tired or bored of Tau, or gun lines aren't that good right now because terrain or whatever else, whatever the reasoning is, if you can switch to something different that you already have as your second faction, that's going to help break up the monotony for you, as well as help you learn that other thing that you normally don't interact with. So if I go play, a Corn Demon list after my Tau, I'm going to learn about the assault phase. So even when I go back to Tau, I can make an argument of that helped me play Tau better because I better understand the assault phase. So there's a whole bunch of factors that kind of all pile together, even if you don't recognize them, that your second faction should be kind of reflexive of whatever it is, the play style that you're currently playing. And it can go in the opposite way, right? If you're playing a bunch of, like, a heavy psychic phase army because you're playing Thousand Suns, your second faction should go really light on Psyker, with whether it's Admech or maybe Necron, something like that, where you're really limited on that, because it'll help break that up. You don't end up building basically the same list with a different paint scheme, and then wonder why it doesn't like spark that joy or that difference when you're going to play them on the table.
Right. Yeah, I mean, oh man, there are also some factions that can do two things. Like, I'm trying to think.
Sure.
Chaos Space Marines, like Luffy's just in Black Legion by itself. That range is actually so wide that you could do a melee thing, or a shooting thing, or a psychic thing.
Absolutely. And factions like that, you can go one of two routes when you're looking at finding the reflex of that. You can, if you're playing that and you leaned towards, let's say, the close combat Black Legion, right? You could just keep expanding that faction, and you can just go whole hog into that. And there are some players that do that, because like we have a guard player, right? And he has literally every model in spades. He could not put them, he has more Bane Blades than he could ever put on the table, that sort of thing. And you can just go deep into your one faction if you really feel connected to that faction. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you want to break it up, you want to try to force yourself to like scrap your list, start with a base that you know of, like, what units wouldn't I take? And then you put those in the list and you're like, I have to figure out how to make them good. And then you explore that unit that you would never take normally to understand the other parts of your faction. Or the other option is if you have a balanced faction, kind of like Black Legion, where you could do anything. You just have to recognize that I'm playing Assault faction Black Legion, so when I go to my second faction, I want to lean more towards Psychic Phase, or I want to lean more towards movement-based factions, because that's a thing that I'm not really using at the moment.
Well, I've seen people collect variety like that, but on a theme where, like, they'll do all the Chaos Legions, or just like a couple different ones because they want to stay chaos. But also I've seen it, I want to say more often, players will be like, I'm going to pick one Imperium army and one Chaos army and one Xenos army, and then that's it. They're different flavors of gameplay, but then they feel like they have little pieces of the sections of the universe, so to speak,
Yep.
so that they can change it up. Especially if they're doing narrative campaigns or whatever, a lot of people use collections like that to just run the little narrative stuff with their friends. Like,
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's really good because just like me, right? I talked about how I'm a Space Wolf player, but when I went to my second faction way back in the day, I went to Necrons because it was Xenos and it was very different in playstyle. It was back then anyway. Necrons was designed to be more gunliney. So I found that reflexive thing, but I also hopped the pie chart of factions to go to Xenos. That way I didn't get bored with the hobbying part and like painting another marine. Sure, it's in a different paint scheme, but it's still a marine, that sort of thing.
yeah.
And that's still a really good idea to do that as well.
Well, I don't really have anything else. Do you? That you want to mention?
No, I think that's a solid basis. Like when it comes to actually picking a faction, I've gone way more in depth with people at the store and online about the different play styles and really picking out an individual faction that they identify with. But I think that's the broad strokes, and that's the important things to keep in mind when you go out and start researching all the factions that you don't really know about, and just keep that open mind for something to jump out at you so that you can really connect with it when you decide to start that next faction or your first one.
Yeah. No, totally. Okay. Well, you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, I think that's fairly wrapped up. This is a part of our Tactics Tuesday series. We are going to try to keep bringing these out, especially as we ramp up towards 10th edition. And we will hopefully see you again next week.
Yeah. Well, we'll keep putting these out, especially as the edition starts to ramp up and more teasers are coming and stuff. We'll be doing demo games and testing it out with everybody, and we can chat about it. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope this is helpful.